Hey there.
Is there anyone online?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, good.
It's working now. It's good. All right. With that, 1 more minute, I guess. I thought we could go back to last class we were meditating on and we were studying. The topic was of the four foundations of mindfulness, the fourth, which was mindfulness of phenomena. And so I'm going to go back to that and sort of start there again. Um, and I actually want to try two different, because they in there they talk about the what's it called, like, phenomena that are contaminated by the mental affliction, are connected to the mental afflictions, and the ones that are pure, right, like unconnected to mental afflictions. And so what I wanted to suggest is actually, so let's start with the mental afflictions ones. What I want to ask just folks to do for a few minutes, we just do a couple together, a few minutes together, is to start by thinking. So think back to a time, probably won't be too difficult, unfortunately, when you were experiencing one or any, some mental affliction. So it might be like jealousy or uh, anger or craving. And just take a few minutes just to remember, to go over, like, so what is the actual experience like, right? This is my part of mindfulness of phenomena, is noting that, right? Experience, like noting we don't usually do that, right? We get caught up in whatever mental state. But here, we're practicing mindfulness with wisdom that it analyzes, right? Part of the definition of the foundations of mindfulness is that, um, you're being mindful, so you're holding something in your mind without losing it or forgetting it, but then also you're understanding it with your wisdom, your own personal wisdom. So that means that in this case, we're going to analyze. So what's my actual experience like? What's my mind like? How does my body feel when I'm experiencing that mental state? In Buddhist psychology, we call those mental afflictions because, from the Buddha asserts that those mental states are afflicted, which means that they're in the nature of suffering, that they're unpeaceful, that the mind is actually on the body too, like I'm agitated. You can even go through, right? Like, how does that mental state arise? How did it first arise for me? What was it like as it remained over a period of time? And what did it lead to? just take a few minutes. You can stay with that same mental affliction, or you can go to others. Uh, what we're trying to do here is just take a few minutes to like remember, and analyze your own experience, right? So what's it like over time? Not just that one time, right? But actually, any mental affliction that came to mind, it's very likely that you have it. We're habituated to certain mental afflictions more than others, so it's likely we have them repeatedly. It's certainly do. So just try to have a sense for yourself. Okay, so what's my experience like over months or years in relation to that mental affliction? What is it? What is it? What is my experience like, actually, moment after moment, when I'm in that mental affliction, or when that mental affliction is, when my mind is in the nature of that mental affliction, under the influence of that mental affliction. The Buddha asserts that's the cause of my suffering. So now I'm checking, is that my experience? Can I see that? Or do I disagree with the Buddha on that point? Mm. Shanti Deva says, like, although they don't want suffering, they run towards the causes of suffering. Mm. So, does that describe me, actually? Am I someone who doesn't want to suffer, but actually goes, cherishes the causes of suffering, actually, or goes towards them? How does that mental affliction, or how do those mental afflictions like affect me in the moment, but also over time? And then they tell that same that teaching on the for foundation of mindfulness of phenomena also talks about pure phenomena. So in this case, let's contrast what we were just analyzing with it. Try to remember or give rise to or imagine a state simple, right, where you're actually just where you're content. So you're free from attachment, free from anger, free from at least overt ignorance. You have subtle ignorance of grasping actual existence, but where you're just in a simple, contented state of not craving for anything in that moment, not angry at anybody or anything, not jealous, not defensive, not trying to promote yourself, not trying to just a moment where you're not under the influence of egotism, let's say, you're just feeling contented. And contrast those former states of mind with that state of mind in your own experience. What's that like, right, to actually feel content? in the present moment. Try to remember or imagine, right? Like a state of contentment, which is like non-craving and non-hatred, being sustained just for some period of time. And what's that kind of what is or what would that kind of experience be like? You can also like last time I suggested meditate, in daily life, meditating on like loving kindness for all beings. So shift your attention to that. What's that experience like? To whatever extent you can experience, you have experience, right? Bring a memory to mind of that kind of practice, loving kindness for all beings. And say, well, what's that like? How does that compare in my own experience to to anger or to jealousy or to craving? What's the inner experience of my own mind and body? We did earlier when I'm jealous or angry or craving. Now, what's it like to experience uh, loving kindness for all beings? And connecting this meditation on mindfulness of phenomena to our motivation to start the class, we can also, to the extent you can, cultivate that kind of um, motivation, right? So my motivation is to be able to overcome the mental afflictions, and to give rise to limitless loving kindness, limitless compassion, bodhicitta, in order to free others from their mental affliction and lead them to enlightenment. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of generosity and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Hmm. So so that's because we kind of well, we finished the section. We were doing the right in the 37 harmonies with enlightenment, the first four, the four foundations of mindfulness, and we kind of covered those. So now we're on the next set of four, um, which are called, and there are different translations of these four. Um, in the text, by the way, for those who are following along in the text by Emily Sue, right? Oh no, I'm actually using transcript of a commentary. Well, that's fine. I'm actually using Geshe Tenzin Seppel's. Oh no, yeah. Well, that's what I'm using today. Okay. Transcript of a commentary on the Ornament for Clear Realizations. Um, anyway, there are different translations of these terms, but in this text I have in front of me, they call it the four perfect abandonings. Sometimes they're called the four correct abandonings rather than perfect. And sometimes the four in Tipton Chodron and Solis Dalai Lama's book, they call them the four supreme strivings. Anyway, we'll get into what they actually. I sometimes think the English term aren't perfect words actually. So we'll get into the definition of what it is, and then you'll know what we're talking about better. Um, and Jody, sorry, I'm in the for some I don't know, I thought I had actually I thought I was using Emily Sue's text, but it turns out today I'm using transcript of a commentary to the Ornament of Clear Realizations, Chapter 4, the application, explanation of the application and complete aspects by Geshe Tenzin Seppo. I think that was emailed out to people, but um, it's also at Emily Sue's text. I just brought a different text today for whatever reason. So it's the same section. So if you find the section on those four, the next four, set of four, it'll be the same. They're the same four things. It's a commentary. The translation is a translation by it's in both texts, I think, and it's a translation of Jetson Choki Gelton's commentary to the chapter four of the Ornament for Clear Realizations. For those who are following along, some people were asking. Um, but so actually, I just want to me there are a number of important points here. But one is like so these are still these these are also practiced from the level of the path of accumulation all the way up to Buddhahood is one point. Uh, so they're part of the path of accumulation, but they're all, you still practice them after, but they're a focus there. But I think first important point I want to emphasize before I even give the definition is that I think psychologically there's something very interesting and helpful here, which is that these arise from the four foundations of mindfulness. And the four foundations of mindfulness, I said this before, they start with the easier, which is mindfulness of the body, right? It's because I mean that's why actually it's why when Tibet I noticed that when Tibetan lamas came to the West, right, to America, oftentimes they start with mindfulness of breathing. Well, it's the easiest thing to stay mindful of. Uh, you know, mindfulness of phenomena is more difficult. Mindfulness of mind is also more difficult, and so on. So anyway, so first one emphasizes the four foundations of mindfulness, and one actually, which is actually really important, right? Because I said this before, you can study the Four Noble Truths, right, which is the fundamental teaching of the Buddha, and you can understand it, which is great, very good thing. But if you just listen to it and think about it, that's good, right? But it's not yet directly related to your own experience. And with the four foundations of mindfulness, in the commentary, I said this, right? They're actually meditations on the Four Noble Truths, right? So and each one correlates to a certain one of the noble truths particularly, but each of them teaches you about all four noble truths, but particularly about one, right? The body particularly teaches about suffering. Um, oh, great. Feelings about the cause of suffering. Uh, mindfulness of mind particularly teaches you about the cessation of suffering, and mindfulness of phenomena particularly teaches you about the path to the end of suffering, right? Because the path to the end of suffering involves overcoming the mental afflictions and cultivating the completely pure qualities of the path. So um, that's how that works. And so, a bodhisattva, say, on the path of accumulation for a long time would emphasize uh, meditating on the four foundations of mindfulness to personalize and to understand based on their own experience the Four Noble Truths. And then psychologically, what this text is explaining is what happens is the bodhisattva gradually reaches a point where, or it could be, well, in this case, we're teaching the bodhisattvas, but the 37 harmonies to enlightenment also are practiced by those on the individual liberation vehicles. The same thing would happen. Is there comes a point where the person develops what the text says is an aspiration. In other words, that and it grows stronger and stronger, where the person starts to feel, the practitioner starts to feel more and more strongly, I want to abandon the causes of suffering. I want to achieve the paths, right? The qualities of the path, the positive states of mind. And it's no longer just like sort of a vague thought, it becomes a powerful aspiration, right? And so these four perfect abandonings are expressions of that, right? So they come out of the four foundations of mindfulness based on your own experience. So you start to see, Lisa Richard last time, oh, she's online today, was saying that, right? That she felt like a prisoner. She started contemplating the mental afflictions, phenomena. She said, oh, it felt like a prison. So the person starts to feel, I want to be free from that prison, right? And then if you start to experience the joy of loving kindness, right? The joy of compassion, the joy of wisdom, right? Then you start to feel like, I want that. I don't want to be stuck in ignorance. I want to actually have more and more experience of that wisdom, right? And so it becomes this like deep aspiration for practice. So, so that now I'll read the quote. I'll read a quote from the actual Tibetan translation of the Tibetan commentary. It says, so first of all, they call it the paths that arise from exertion or effort, which are the four perfect abandonings or the four supreme strivings. And it says, um, to indicate the second set, right? This is the second set of sets of in the 37 harmonies. In order to explain the statement, uh, so here it says, there is a reason for explaining the paths that arise from effort or exertion after the paths that thoroughly investigate things, right? So he's saying this comes after, explain this after you explain the four foundations of mindfulness, which investigate things. Why so? It is from having engaged in such examination of bodies, right form, feelings, and so on, and mind and phenomena by way of their specific and general characteristics. So you keep analyzing those, right? And eventually, what happens? The joyous effort that acts to discard the objects of abandonment and adopt the antidotes to arises, right? And so it becomes this joyful effort at wanting to abandon the one and cultivate the other. Um, and then it says, since such joyous effort towards engagement will arise regarding the paths that arise from exertion, non-virtue and virtue, right? So you want to abandon non-virtues and cultivate virtues. And in this case, I always think that word virtue is funny. I don't know, like I guess it's used both in like Judeo-Christian context and also in sort of later in like European philosophers use the word virtue, right? But in actually in Buddhism, it's an important point. What is virtue, actually, right? It really means something that's true, realistic, and that leads to happiness. And non-virtue is something distorted that leads to unhappiness. So it's important to recognize that it's not some. So it's and because the reason why I'm saying that, by the way, is because you're supposed to have already seen that right through your practice of mindfulness. So it's not supposed to be like somebody telling you this is sin and this is good. It's supposed at this point, the person, based on their own experience, has seen, oh wow, I'm in a distorted state when I'm like this, and I'm making myself miserable. And this is more realistic, and it makes me feel peaceful. Right. So non-virtue and virtue is that, if that makes sense. Um, so then well, here the translation is a little funny. I'm just going to say so. Um, Here, what they say is perfect abandon. The person practices begins to practice joyous effort regarding these four. So, what are the four? Here, the way they translate it is perfect abandonment, non-generation, increase, and generation. Um, what it's actually getting at is I'll use this actually. I'm going to use a different translation from the Dalai Lama's book. So it says there they call them the four supreme strivings. So the first of them is to prevent the arising of non-virtues that have not yet arisen. Right. And so that's where you haven't yet given rise to a certain non-virtue or mental affliction or bad trait. And you think, wow, I see that that kind of trait exists in the world. I see beings have it. Let me not do that. Let me not give rise to that non-virtue because it will cause me suffering. Right. And that's where actually, like, I mean, just in a very common sense, right? Common way, it's like what's we're learning from the experience of others, like, which most of us, some of us don't do well, but is a good idea. Right. So in other words, so if you have if there's a certain mental affliction that you don't have, that you read about in a text or you see other people suffering from, and you go, well, thank goodness I don't have that. I don't need to go down that path. You know, yeah, I don't need that problem. Exactly. Then the second one is to abandon non-virtues that have arisen. Right. So in other words, that you honestly look from your practice of mindfulness, of phenomena at, okay, thank goodness I don't have those, but I have plenty of my own, mental afflictions and non-virtuous traits. And I see how they cause me suffering. So now I'm going to abandon those, right? So that's abandonment. Abandon or overcome the mental afflictions you have. Then the next one is to generate virtues that have not yet arisen, right? So if you say, well, like for example, well, I mean, it could be compassion or love, right? But you could say, well, I haven't yet, like I haven't yet generated wisdom, understanding emptiness correctly. Let me generate that, right? I need to generate that. I haven't yet given rise to the bodhicitta. Let me give rise to bodhicitta. So you start aspiring to give rise to new virtues, new positive states of mind that lead to happiness. And then the last one is when you see that you've given rise to a certain virtue, you think, may I not let it decrease, but may I increase it? Right. So you aspire to increase those qualities in yourself. And so those are the four correct abandonings or four perfect strivings, however you want to call them. And there are a lot more details in a minute, but I just want so you get the idea. First of all, how the first 2 points. One is how it arises from mindfulness, right? So from mindfulness of having seen for yourself how things, what causes suffering and what causes happiness, what causes well-being and what makes you miserable, then you start to generate this kind of aspiration and you start to make joyful effort and at those four things, right? And they make sense. You see how they're connected to mindfulness and you see what the four are. So those are the first 2 points. Then I want to pause, and I often, we're going to get into what's joyous effort and all that, but okay, maybe I will say, okay, actually, I'm going to quote, I'm just going to quote briefly, Lama Tsongkhapa in his middle-length Lamrim says, what is joy? Because we're using the word joyous effort, right? So I want to say, what's joyous effort? So we'll quote Lama Tsongkhapa, who himself is quoting Asanga, it's Bodhisattva Bhumi, Bodhisattva levels. So he says, joyous effort is a mind, right? So it's an inner state that is truly delighted to gather virtue and work for the welfare of sentient beings, as well as the actions of body, speech, and mind motivated by that kind of joyful mind. And whenever I think of joy, I want to pause there and ask you something, just to think about something together for a minute, which is like, so joyous effort is like where you feel happy to make effort at something. And I often think about this, like actually, well, I guess I think about, well, partly my experience, but also it started when I was first studying this. Lama Zopa Rinpoche was my late teacher, one of my teachers who's passed away. I always thought of him as like almost like an sort of, he came from Nepal, right? And I sometimes thought of him almost like he would have said this, but like an anthropologist who was looking at human beings and going like, you don't want to know it. And he used to say, he would like look around because he was like traveling in the West. He was from Nepal in a remote, he had grown up, um, he lived in a region where his natural inclination would have been to stay in a cave and meditate.
Right.
Um, and then he traveled the entire planet, much more than I ever have or ever will. So he saw all the different cultures of the world, over and over. And And he used to reflect on this. I was just sharing it because to me it's connected to joyous efforts. He would say, like, "Wow, look how much effort people make at such strange things." And he would say, yeah, well, he because he grew up near Mount Everest. He would say, like, people spend so much money and time to climb Mount Everest. And then he said, who cares? Like, it has no meaning, totally meaningless. You got to the top of that mountain. You know, where he grew up, everybody was like, it was like right there. And everybody grew up there. It was like, why in the world would you want to climb that? You might die, and who cares? Like, you got to the top of the mountain. Like, we live on it halfway up a mountain. Like, what a stupid thing to put your energy into. But the people would be like jumping up, they'd be so excited that they climbed Mount Everest. And then he would say, or like, shot putting in the Olympics or something, right? He would go like, so the person spent like the first 28 years of their life throwing a ball, like a heavy thing. And he would say, like, and then they won an award, like a gold medal. And he would just look and he would go, like, why do they do that? And he would say, like, I don't understand. Like, like it doesn't lead to happiness, and which it doesn't, right? Like, actually, going off on a tangent here, but it just made me pop to my mind. Like, right, winning a gold medal. He used to use that example often. He'd say people work so hard to win a gold medal. And then it made me remember when I was actually before I met him, when I was in high school, I remember reading the autobiography of Muhammad Ali, and he described his experience of winning a gold medal in the Olympics. And he came back to America, and he went back. He was traveling, and he was somewhere I can't remember where he was, and people were treating him poorly, as had been his experience up to that point because of race. And he wrote the story. He went to a bridge, and he took the gold medal and he threw it in the river off the bridge because he thought this doesn't have any meaning at all to me. Like, who gives a crap? It's kind of his response, um, which I thought was similar. It was his direct experience of that. But as well, almost over what he was getting at, which is like people make effort for things that actually don't lead to happiness, right? He was saying it didn't lead him to. I guess he was Cassius Clay at the time. It didn't lead him to happiness. Anyway, what I wanted to ask you to think about for a moment is like the people around you. What do they do? What do they make joyous effort? And just like think about it just for a moment, right? Like actually, like because actually some people don't make any joyous effort in anything, of course. Like, but that's actually most people do though, actually, at something, right? Like, um, where they'll feel great energy to get something, right? And actually, if and different people, of course, different every individual's. Well, actually, I mean, there are various things, right? The people are somewhat different at what they do that for. It's partly influenced by culture, right, and region and other factors, but biology, I suppose too. But like, what did your parents make joyous effort for, if anything? Just like ask yourself that, right? Because it influences you. Like actually, it does influence you, right? Whatever you saw your parents or grandparents making joyous effort for, influenced your psychology somehow or other. What are the people in your culture make joyous effort for? Um, and uh, and why? Actually, like, and then the next question is like, why do people make effort for the things they make effort for? Like, what's their cause? Like, what's the reason that they make effort towards those things? And just like that's part of this, right? I'm just suggesting that's a good contemplation to do in connection to these four. And then you can ask yourself, this one's kind of weird. Like, is over the course of my life, from the time I was like, say, a kid to now, what have I made joyous effort towards? And like, I was thinking that for myself, and I was like, oh my gosh, I remember being like a little kid and caring so much about like things that I'm like, like I wanted to collect a certain baseball card or something. I was like, where it's like kind of, wow, I really cared about like, and I can remember like the experience of like really caring, that like, oh, I want to, or wanting to stay up late to whatever, watch a certain TV show, I don't know, whatever. It was like something, at a certain age, it's like you think this is something important. Um, and what are all the things you've over the course of your life that you've like because joyous effort, right, is like that. Like I want to stay up. I don't care if I have to stay up late. I don't care if I have to get up early. I want to do that. It's like so good. Now, I don't mind, I'm not just don't mind, like I'm happy to, you know, you want to run like you want to run there to go get that, right? Um, and it's not to criticize yourself, it's just to analyze like why did I make effort at that? Like you try to remember, like even like, wow, why was I trying to make effort to have that? Um, and can you even remember? I don't know, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't probably, but um you see what I'm going? So yeah, anyway, it's interesting to do that. I'm just saying before you get into the actual practices here, I think it's useful to step back and say, what are the people I know, right? My own family, my close friends, the people I grew up around, the people I live around now, my neighbors. What do they make joyous effort at? What are they happy to work towards? What have I, over the course of my life, made? And then actually, probably if you're a Buddhist practitioner, that might be more to say, what do I now make joyous effort towards? And and why? Right? Ask yourself that question. Why do I make effort towards that? Is it based on mindfulness of with wisdom analyzing my own experience, or is it based on culture or somebody told me, or I have some weird habit of that, whatever, because of how I grew up, or some other thing, or whatever, some other reason, whatever the reasons are. But you're analyzing here yourself, right? Your own experience. And then you say, because so you have, I think I just that's not in the teaching, by the way, that's just my own suggestion. Uh, but then you come back to because here, right, in the practice of Dharma, you're basing your joy, you're trying to cultivate a sense of joyous effort based on mindfulness. That's what the text said, right? Based on your own experience of mindfulness in relation to your own body, feelings, right? Mind and phenomena. Um, and by analyzing them with wisdom, comparing those to the Four Noble Truths and seeing if they relate to the Four Noble Truths based on your experience. If that makes sense. So so that's yeah. And then the next point I was going to make, and then is this isn't in the this is in the Dalai Lama's book. It's not in the other commentary. Uh, Solanus and Thupten Chodron quote the Sutra of the Ten Grounds. I think it's called the Dasabhamika, the Bhumis, the Ten Bhumi Sutra. So there, after each of these four, the Buddha says, like I read like for example, the first one to prevent the arising of non-virtues that have not yet arisen. Right, that was the first of the four. The Buddha says to prevent those, he or she generates aspiration, makes effort, arouses energy, holds the mind firmly, and steadfastly places the mind. So, and then for each of them, the Buddha says, to abandon non-virtues that have not yet arisen, that have arisen rather, one generates aspiration, makes effort, arouses energy, holds the mind firmly, and steadfastly places the mind. So the first thing is the aspiration, right? And there's nothing works, there is in this practice, nothing works without aspiration. So the first thing is, here you're trying to cultivate first um, a clarity, right? Like, oh, that would really be, like having these men, like for myself, not in some generic way and not about somebody else, but based on my experience, like this particular mental affliction is having this mental affliction or that mental affliction is unbearable anymore. I can't take it. It's a totally miserable thing. And if I could cultivate the antidote to it, right? Like then that would really be like the coolest thing in the world, or whatever. That would be awesome. That would be great, right? And so you keep analyzing that, right? You keep checking, and then you eventually generate an aspiration. I really want to do that, right? And um, these are presented. I want to say something too, like the four foundations of mindfulness and the four supreme strivings are presented sequentially in the 37 harmonies, but it says very clearly both are practiced from the path of accumulation all the way to the Buddha ground. So you don't stop one. So what I'm getting at there is just from a practical perspective. I've just been noticing I've been practicing these myself lately. And one thing I started noticing is sometimes based on my previous practice of mindfulness, there's an immediate feeling of striving, right? Like, oh, I want to cultivate loving kindness. Wake up and you feel that way. Other days, not so much, right? You wake up and you think, oh, wow, like, never think about breakfast or something, whatever it might be. Something. So then you have to go back to mindfulness, don't you? You know, it's like, because if you just say to yourself, oh, wait a second, I want to strive for love, for example, or loving kindness, I want to strive for wisdom. Well, that's just saying I want to, but it doesn't actually necessarily lead to striving, right? So you have to go back then to mindfulness and say, wait, why would I strive for that? Right? And um and actually the reason why I mentioned earlier what do you strive for naturally, right? Is like that's how it always works, right? Like whereas if you say to somebody, and it could be something like for kids, it could be like say getting good grades, or it could be liking a certain sports team, right? Like or liking a certain kind of music or something, right? Like whereas if you tell a kid, oh, you should try to get good grades, their normal first response is like, why? Right. And then if the parent keeps saying to them, well, here's why, and then like other people start telling them, especially if they have peers who are trying to get good grades, right? Then like that helps for that. Then they start getting, so if they keep hearing the benefits, right? And then they keep getting some kind of reinforcement, like approval for one and disapproval for the other, and it molds their behavior, right? Or with like, I always really or to say the with the sports team, who cares, right? But then if everybody if all their friends like a certain sports team, then it starts, and their parents do or something, then it starts to become like that. Anyway, whatever it might be. But my point is like it takes repeated, in those cases, repeated that's word, external influence. Here it's supposed to be internal influence. Um, and so you go back and you say, well, so like if let's say I'm using the example of loving kindness, right? So let's say one day you're walking around and feel annoyed. You think, why would I cultivate loving kindness? Where else is annoying? So then you stay with the question. You say, yeah, why would I? Let me go back to mindfulness. What's good about loving kindness? And why is it better than some other state? Let me check my own experience. Is it actually better than some other state? And then you practice mindfulness and you see if it again gives rise to aspiration. Because you can't do the supreme strivings unless you have aspiration. Does that make sense? So again, in the text, it's like, first we teach the four foundations of mindfulness, then we teach the four supreme strivings. But in a practice perspective, one does have to come after the other, but not like once and for all. It's not like, okay, now I'm done with mindfulness. Now I'm only a practitioner of the four supreme strivings, right? You keep going back to mindfulness in order to strengthen your aspiration. Anyway, you get it. And you see how that's a very practical, like psychological way of working with yourself. And actually, this is Dharma. I want to say too. So that's Dharma practice, actually. And with these four supreme strivings, they're mainly in terms of the 37 harmonies of enlightenment, they begin on the path of accumulation. But of course, if we're not yet on the path of accumulation, there's no choice. If you want to practice Dharma, you have to practice them, right? Because there is no other Dharma practice, actually. And that's where um I remember like I'm quoting on Zohar. He was like particularly emphasized this teaching, so I'm quoting him a bit. But he used to say something like, well, people, well, you're just so sometimes he would say, like to somebody who had not practicing these yet, right? He would say, well, you don't stop doing the Dharma practice you're pretending to practice, but it's not actually Dharma practice yet. Uh, because the person would say they were, doing some kind of ritual, or they were offering things on their water bowls, or they were doing a prayer, and you say, well, that's good. That, it's you're pretending to practice Dharma, like keep doing that, and eventually you'll actually start to practice. But real practice has to come from right mindfulness of your own four foundation. You're actually practicing mindfulness and then generating aspiration, and then this is the actual practice, right? Is trying to overcome the mental afflictions and cultivate the virtues. And it doesn't matter actually if you're practicing like meditation on emptiness or you're practicing tantra or something. If you're not practicing in an effort to overcome mental affliction, cultivate virtue, then you're not practicing dharma, right? So it doesn't. It's not. So whether you're doing like some kind of Mahamudra or you're doing Dzogchen or you're doing Sugar, it doesn't matter what you're doing. My point is, if it's not with this kind of motivation, aspiration, then it's not actually Dharma practice. It's pretending to do Dharma practice, which is still better than hurting people. You know, so it's good, but it's not yet Dharma practice. So anyway, this is Dharma practice actually. Um, so uh, yeah, so okay. So maybe it's good to then say, um, so what does he mean? So aspiration is first, right? So you have this aspir based on your mindfulness, you develop aspiration. So as long as the Dalai Lama's commentary. He says, uh, so based on aspiration, we begin to do the meditative practices of these four supreme strivings, right? Then he says, next thing in the that sutra was making effort. So he says, making effort is the remedy to imbalance to is the remedy to the imbalance of serenity and insight. Um, so what does that mean actually? Well, first of all, I would say in general, right? Making effort means you start making effort to cultivate these, right? The virtues and to overcome the negative states of mind. But in particular, what he's saying is, if you're going to try to do that, you need to develop serenity here means shamatha, right? So you have to start to develop concentration. If you really want to cultivate positive states of mind and overcome negative ones, well, you're not going to succeed at that very much if you can't concentrate because it's a mental practice mainly, right? So what he's getting is, first of all, you have to start to cultivate some shamatha, right? Some ability to keep your mind focused on, because let's say you develop, Frank was saying, he said he tried the homework assignment, right? I said, can you cultivate loving kindness while brushing your teeth for a whole toothbrushing? And Frank, he said it wasn't so easy. Frank said that at the beginning. I hope it's okay I shared it. But so and that's part of this, right? So if you're trying to cultivate loving kindness, I'm using that as the example from today, right? Well, if you can't keep your serenity means shamatha means like keeping your mind on the object, right? So if you can't keep your mind on loving kindness, then you might make some effort to cultivate loving kindness, then it disappears in a second. And then you make effort again, it disappears. That's still good. That is Dharma practice, by the way, right? But it's not lasting, right? So what you want to start to do is cultivate an ability to say, develop loving kindness and then hold your mind on it. First 4 minutes, right? Someday for 4 hours, whatever, like, and so on, right? Um, and so you have to develop that, right? And then Selena says, making effort is a remedy. First, you have to develop that, and then to balance that with insight, meaning vipassana, right? Special insight. But it's not yet special. He uses insight, not special insight, because it's not yet special insight actually here. When it becomes special insight, you've achieved the path of, I mean, because we're talking about the path of accumulation right now. And when you develop the unity of calm abiding and special insight, you've achieved the path of preparation, the next of the five paths. But to get there, so in other words, you're on the path of accumulation right, at this point. So you're developing shamatha, calm abiding, or serenity, they're calling it here, and you're cultivating insight, understanding, right? In the context of your meditation practice into these topics. And what you're trying to do is balance them, right? And what happens actually, first of all, you have to develop calm abiding, which takes effort, which is why we say making effort, right? But then there's a whole practice where once you develop calm abiding, you can keep your mind on a certain object. But if you want to develop deeper insight into something, your mind loses the object. It becomes distracted because you're analyzing, or it doesn't keep the same level of what's the word? Uh, it doesn't keep the same level of focus and the same level of peace because when you analyze, the mind gets slightly agitated or slightly disturbed, slightly moved. And so there's a whole practice where you learn to balance those two by going back and forth. You keep your mind on calm abiding, then you start to do analysis, and the mind starts to lose, but then you go back to the calm abiding, and you learn to balance those very carefully, and eventually they become unified. And that's when you achieve that, and emptiness, that's the path of preparation, actually. So you have to focus. So you can see why, by the way, you can see why this is practiced all the way to the Buddha ground, but you really are starting to cultivate this when you're on the path of accumulation, trying to get to the path of preparation. Um, so the Dalai Lama says, as you're making such effort to develop your ability to hold the mind on virtue that are the antidotes, the non-virtues, he says this is accomplished by three things: serenity, holding the mind firmly, and equanimity. And he says, and this is where he's getting what I was just saying. So he says, so during meditation, if insight is more powerful than calm abiding, uh, then the mind is not balanced and is like a lamp in the wind. So that's what he was getting at, right? So if you're doing too much insight and you start to lose your piece of your tranquility, it's like a flame that's being blown around, so it's not peaceful enough, right? So then in that case, you need to practice serenity. You need to practice calm abiding again. Does that make sense? That's what I was just saying. So if you notice your mind is starting that when you're analyzing things, your mind is getting too agitated, you switch back and focus on one object without any analysis to calm the mind again. Then he says, when the lamp of serenity isn't, and he's giving the example of emptiness, where he's saying if that wavering is happening, then you won't penetrate the meaning of emptiness, for example, because the mind is wavering too much. So you need to keep the mind calm and on calm abiding. Then he says, uh, if you've cultivated that remedy of serenity, that's good. But then sometimes serenity becomes strong, but there's no penetrative insight. There's no clarity. There's no understanding. And then he says at that time, ultimate reality won't be perceived correctly because the mind isn't clear enough and isn't having enough insight. So he says, then you have to hold the mind firmly, which is like tighten your effort, uh, and sort of make more effort and analysis at that time. Um, and then he says, when those two are balanced, then you practice equanimity, which is you don't do either one. You just keep going as you're going, right? And you keep them even. And so what he's getting at there, you get it, is like, if you're actually on the path of accumulation, you're literally doing that. You develop calm abiding, because if you want to get when you're on the path of accumulation, you're trying to get to the path of preparation. So you develop calm abiding and you start doing this practice of balancing calm abiding and insight in order to more deeply, especially like sort of like realize in your own experience emptiness. So you're trying to do that. But I want to step back for a second. For us, right, or if you're not at that level yet, still this applies. Does that make sense? So point being, like if you're trying to cultivate, you may not have calm abiding, for example, so you can't cultivate the union of calm abiding and special insight if you don't have calm abiding, you can't unify it with special insight, for example, right? But it's good to know that's what you're doing in these practices eventually. But for us, right, even if we're not at that level, we need to still, first of all, generate aspiration, right? And then make effort. Right? So we need to make effort. So, for example, and going back to my simple example, if you're trying to cultivate loving kindness for all beings, we have to make effort at it, right? And if you start to notice, in our case, might be that I'm totally distracted from that. Well, great, notice that, right? And then you say, well, what do I need to do about it? Let me come back to my mindfulness. Let me come back to cultivating loving kindness. And then, if, and I'll give an example. If before you could hold your mind on loving kindness for, say, 30 seconds, and then you say, well, now I can do a minute. That's great progress, right? And I can do a minute and a half, and then, and can I do it? Like, how long can I do that when I'm sitting in quiet, meditating just on loving kindness? Then can I do it while I walk? If I go out for a walk around the block, how far can I get before I'm distracted? And see, can I eventually get like halfway around my block without losing love and kindness? And that's like, um, I don't know. And actually, I was about to say that's fun, but that's what we're getting at here. It's joyous effort, right? Like, oh wow, that's really cool. I get to try to do that. I'm going to do it during my meditation. I'm going to do it when I brush my teeth, or when I take a walk, or when I cook a meal. How can I cook the whole meal with loving kindness? Or not? Do I lose by loving kindness as I'm cooking a meal? And if you lose it, that's fine, right? But this is the joyous effort, right? Is joyous effort is like, oh well, that's what's fun. That's what's interesting. Can I do more? It might be emptiness. It might be compassion. It might be some other practice. But whichever practice you're doing, joyous effort is like, wow, can I get better at that? Right? Can I cultivate that more? And what's that like? The Buddha says love can be cultivated infinitely. You know, let's see how far I can get. This month. Uh, let's see how much. How intensely I can cultivate that. What would that be like? And like you get the point of love I'm sorry, of about this joyous effort thing, right? You start to feel like that's what's interesting. That's what's exciting. Uh, and then like if you're having certain mental affliction, you go, wow, what's the antidote to that mental affliction, right? And which one works for me? And you start to get excited, right? Because one of them is abandoning mental afflictions you already have, right? So let's say you get angry, right? Like, so you start to go, well, okay, you know, which works for me better? Like, do I meditate on impermanence, or do I meditate on love? Or do I meditate on emptiness? Or do I meditate on the faults of anger and the advantages of patience? Or do I, there actually, if you look in Shanti Deva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, there's a long chapter on patience, and he gives so many techniques, right? And why does he give so many techniques? Well, different ones work for different people, and different works on different days. So I'm just giving one example, right? So you're excited now. Okay, how can I get better at not being angry? Because I've seen through my mindfulness of phenomena that anger makes me miserable, right? So what works for me today? Wow, like, oh, that worked. And like, and then I'll just go. Now I'm gonna make a side joke, but like, then actually, but it's a true point. Actually, Rinpoche once said that. Like, of course, if you start to practice that kind of joyful effort, either you'll become quiet, or people will think you're crazy. Because of course, like ordinary people, if you say, "Oh, today I was like, last week I was angry for 3 minutes, but this week I got down to two," isn't that awesome? Like somebody will look at you and go, okay, it's like, uh, but if that's what your joyful efforts in, that's awesome, right? Like, and of course, if you have like Dharma friends, they'll go, wow, wow, what worked, like, um, and otherwise people will think you're nuts. But we always say, well, that's good, it's okay, it's okay to think people think you're nuts. I'm joking, but you get the point here. Like that's your joyous effort, right? That's what you're excited about, and that's what you're sort of intrigued by, and that's what you're interested in, and other things. And you start to, and they talk about. I mentioned this last time, like giving up on or abandoning or letting go of the affairs of this life, right? At this point, that's not some like it's like, well, anything that's a distraction to doing that, right? If you're trying to be cultivate loving kindness and overcome anger, for example, and then somebody like starts talking to you about something that might lead to anger, like you just want to leave because like, well, that's not why in the world would I want to talk about that? Like, if it's going to make me angry, then that's not helpful. So you start losing interest in things that are connected to the mental afflictions is the point, because they can increase your mental afflictions and you don't want to do that. That makes sense. And that's for you. It's individual. It's not according to somebody else's prescription. It's what increases your mental afflictions, and you want to stay away from that because it's not helpful. Um, and that's another point here. Yeah, it's only Dalai Lama says, um, you know, to do these practices, you must, uh, you guard your mind and you restrain your senses, is one way they say it. So, what does that mean, restraining your senses? In this context, what it really means is, you know, that if you're actually doing these four practices, then you have to, part of the practice is that you have to notice, well, what increases my sense of the path? What contexts do that? And what contexts increase my mental afflictions? And of course, if you're actually practicing this, you're not, if you're not yet on the path, or if you're on the path of accumulation, you're not yet an expert, right? You're not yet. So you have to be practical with yourself, right? So in other words, you have to recognize, well, if some particular behavior or activity, if my main striving, my main interest is to decrease my mental afflictions, and this particular activity increases my mental afflictions, and I can't be in this activity without increasing, then I won't do the activity, or I'll do it less, or I'll try to avoid it as much as I can because that's practical, right? And if some other context helps increase your virtuous states of mind, like love, then you say, well, I want to be there more. Um, because that's what actually works. It's based on your own mindfulness, and it's not based on somebody else's directive. It's based on your own mindfulness of what actually increases my mental affliction, what decreases my mental affliction, what increases my love, or what path, what decreases it. Um, and yeah, I remember being struck by that once, like because like some like even that's even true in advanced practitioners. Like I remember reading that thing. Oh, that was intriguing to me. That like some lamas were saying they like doing group retreats. When they would do a retreat, and then I noticed Kirti Center where she said he spent like 18 years in a hut in the Himalayas because he found that being alone was better for him. And he liked the animal. He would hang out with the animals, and it was like that was what worked for him. And he said that's what works for me. And then he stayed there until his Holiness Dalai Lama sent somebody and said, "You need to come down and teach." So like, and then he said, "Okay," but You see the point there? It's like so. It depends on your mind. That's all I'm saying. It depends. You so you have to check for yourself what increases and decreases my mental afflictions, and it might be these days it might be how much are you exposing yourself to the news or to certain kinds of media or different it's called social media and things like that, right? But check, do they increase or decrease my mental afflictions? And if like if social media increases your practice of the path, then great. If it increases your mental afflictions, then you decrease it. Anyway, and then the next thing in this His Holiness the Dalai Lama says is he says in that list from the Buddha said make effort. Then it says arousing energy. So he says that means to eliminate laxity and excitement, which are the antidotes to calm abiding. Right. So part of arousing energy is that, and he says holding the mind firmly is the remedy to laxity. So in other words, if your mind's too lax, too dull, you're not going to have good concentration, right? Um, and laxity is sort of like where this like the mind is if in extreme form you'd actually fall asleep, right, or sort of doze off. But in meditation, even if you're awake, there's a sense of dullness in the mind or laxity or kind of lowness. So then you strengthen your mind. You hold it more firmly to whatever you're meditating on. Right? You say, "Oh, let me make more effort actually and try harder." And that could be in formal meditation. But as we're talking about, if you try to go around the block and be loving, then think, all right, I'm going to try really hard today. This is my challenge. I'm going to get at least to that bush or something, whatever it might be, that tree. Um, and then he says, and if you hold the mind firmly, your clarity will increase, right? And the intensity of your focus. Um, and then he says also, when you're around, try to hold the mind firmly. If your mind is too lax or too dull, you can visualize light. You can remember things like precious human rebirth and impermanence, things that inspire you to try harder. Uh, and then he says, if your mind is too restless and too agitated, then you steadfastly place the mind. Um, and you do contemplations on things like death to make the mind more sober so that it will calm down and you can focus more deeply. Um, I'll pause there. Any questions or comments? I mean, there's more I can say, but I just want to pause there. Any questions or comments about because those are the sort of those are the key points in these uh, commentaries, and then there's more one can say. But anything about those? I guess questions. Yeah, Frank has.
Yeah, thanks. Well, your presentation of the joyful effort is great. I remember some previous translations. I think one was joyful perseverance, which had a different connotation for me. It was sort of like, okay, we try to be joyful to get through some sorrow somehow. But I like this is much more positive, but I don't know if you had any commentary about why they said joyful perseverance.
Yeah, I actually think, one point is like, if you look at the Sanskrit, it's virya, right? Virya paramita, the perfection of joyous effort, uh, which is actually has the same root as like virility or something. So it's like I actually think energy, it's like there's an energy, and I remember, well, it says it right here in Lama Tsongkhapa, right? He says, and it's from the Bodhisattva Bhumi, he says, delight in gathering virtue, right? So I actually, I think, I know I've seen perseverance or, and I think in some of there are like that word joyous. Yeah. Personally, I think joyous effort is the best. For me, it's the best translation of this. Um, because it accords with what Lama Tsongkhapa and Asanga are saying. And we can get more into joyous effort. I think it's great. But yeah, because I don't know, like perseverance doesn't really imply to me delight, right? In gathering virtue. It doesn't imply a mind that feels truly delighted. So I would stick with joyous effort because I think it's, you know, um, yeah, there was another translation somebody was using. There are other translations too, like, uh, and yeah, yeah, even like it's interesting. Even where is it? Oh, I was looking at the book. Here it is. Yeah, even though I mean, another translation they use is striving, but I still think I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure, but I think the joyous is the important part, first of all, because that's what it says in the commentary. I like joyous effort personally. Um, one, I'll just going to share this. This is actually a quote from a sutra. Read this. It's a little short quote, but it says, "When you've cultivated this kind of joyous effort, and in the four supreme strivings, I'm calling them." The quote is, "The practitioner will quote slant, slope, and incline towards nirvana." I think that's a beautiful that if you have these four supreme strivings, you will slant, you'll what does it say? Slant,
Well,
you'll slope. It's like like a sled going down the like if you're going down but to me it gives that same feeling of joy, right? Like you'll slant, you'll slope, you'll incline. It's like or it's like a yeah, it's like riding a sled down a icy, down in the snow down the hill. You're gonna slide down to nirvana in that case. So it gets that feeling of joyous effort to me. That quote does. Um, yes, I personally think that's the better translation um, for this one. And I've seen translators use all different terms, but to me, the important part is what Lama Tsongkhapa gets at, which is its joy. Right?
I mean, is the perseverance thing um, used more in conjunction with Shantideva? I mean, the six perfections. It's one of those perseverance.
There is a quality. I mean, well, if we get into, I guess I will say, since you guys are asking about it, like there's in joyous effort. Actually, I'm going to Lama Tsongkhapa now, and the Middle Length Lamrim. He points out that when you're cultivating joyous effort, he makes various points. I mean, it's a beautiful section in the Lamrim on joyous effort, by the way. And he makes this point. He says when you're cultivating the perfection of joyous effort, he says Lama Tsongkhapa says there are three types, and then he says the first is and it's from the Sanskrit commentaries translated. He says the first is armor-like joyous effort, and that one does that one can have an again maybe a connotation like perseverance or something, but not quite. I think what he says is for that one they give this analogy in some of the commentaries where they say if a an ancient in ancient India like an ancient Europe, same thing. They would put on armor before a battle, right? A soldier would put on armor before a battle, and there the idea of armor like is so there's is the kind of joyous effort you do before starting an activity. And what Lama Tsongkhapa explains is he says if you're going to undertake some practice or some effort in Dharma, in your Dharma thing, he says beforehand, analyze it carefully and make sure you want to do it. Make sure it's a good idea. Make sure it's conducive to your level and to who you are and to what will the result you want. And then he says, and then the putting on the armor is where you kind of have the mind, it's a mental armor, where you say, okay, if I'm going to do that, there are going to be obstacles. There are going to be difficulties. That's normal. There can be difficulties anywhere. I'm some samsaric being. Whatever I do, there are going to be difficulties. Um, but you put on the armor in the sense of like you say you sort of cultivate a mental state where you say, I don't care if there are obstacles. This is amazing. This is awesome. And like, and if some obstacles arise, they're gonna bounce off me. I'm gonna tolerate them because, but it's again like the armor. So there is a quality of the way that in that sense, like a kind of perseverance, maybe, but it's more like the person again, that's why I think Lama Sorenshu would use those examples. Like you'd say like it's like it's like when the person's going to climb Mount Everest, right? Like which someone kept saying was silly and meaningless goal. So like they put so much, they know there are going to be all kinds of hardships, but they're like excited about. They're like, part of that's actually part of why they like it, right? Is like they're like, oh, there's going to be oxygen deprivation, there's going to be like freezing cold winds, and there's going to be, but I may fall off a cliff, but that's what makes it like valuable, like they're like excited for that. Which I'm sort of say, oh, they seem crazy to me, but but the point is like it's that kind of armor, if that makes it that kind of perseverance, or or like it's funny. I mentioned like if you see like it's funny, right? If you watch boxers, right, like they're happy to get punched in the face. Actually, it's like part of the thing, right? They're like, oh, now I'll really punch you back. It's like for the goal of just beating somebody up, actually, and I guess getting a prize or something, but um, some money, but here the idea is that you want to cultivate that kind of excitement or something, or that kind of
Mhm.
what's the word? Maybe excitement's the wrong word, but that kind of joy, that kind of like, of course there will be obstacles, but I'm going to achieve something actually. And in this case, what I'm going to achieve is Buddhahood. Like that actually has value. So you don't worry about some challenges along the way, if that makes sense. So that's the armor like one. So that might have a little bit of a connotation of perseverance. Um, but in the teaching on joyous effort, they say do that first, actually. Analyze, because you know, um, you shouldn't if you're going to actually practice joyous effort, choose the right thing for you, and then make effort at it. And like same thing. Actually, I'm just going back to a very simple example. If you're trying to cultivate loving kindness in your real life, say, that's a very simple example, right? Well, for sure, right? Actually, no matter what whether you're trying to cultivate loving kindness or not, right? There are going to come along situations where something's going to provoke you or make you feel annoyed at somebody or something, or you're going to hear, whether it's in your personal life or at work or in a news story. And so, like, if you're going to go, oh, well, now I give up because there was a negative news story or something, that's silly, right? Like, in other words, if you're trying to cultivate loving kindness for all beings, then you think, of course, they're going to be challenged. Like, you know, but that's what loving kindness is about, right? Is you want beings who are suffering to have happy. You want beings to be happy. They're not happy yet. If they were happy, like, so I didn't say more compassion, particularly, right? Looking for the suffering. So you have to do that. Is it whatever you're cultivating, you think, is that worth cultivating? Is it worth my effort? And you kind of guard yourself in that sense. And then the other two, just so we say, are joyous effort of gathering virtuous phenomena, such as the six perfections, and the joyous effort of working for the welfare of sentient beings. Those are the three. And so, what they say is bodhisattva. I just think that's beautiful, isn't it? So, what do bodhisattvas get joyous about? Like, I was saying earlier, like, what did the people you grew up around, or what did you in the previous parts of your life, or what do you now have joyous effort about? So, those are the three things, right? Bodhisattvas analyze carefully and generate that kind of armor. And then they do two things. They put joy into doing good things, right? Like, and there's a difference between joyous of gathering virtuous phenomena. That would be so. That an example of that would be I'm going to cultivate love. That's an example of that. Or I'm going to overcome anger. And then the joy of working for others is actual behavior, right? Like I'm going to, and it could be something simple, like I'm going to help this my neighbor, or I'm going to help this insect or this animal, or it could be whatever, something more extensive, like you know, creating a project or something like that. But again, it's what they say. If you're going to start some big project to help others, you first analyze. That's the armor light, right? You say, is that worth doing? Is that worth? It's going to be difficult. There's going to be challenges. Um, and any other comments or questions? I can see more. Any other comments or questions? Oh, John, yeah, he has hands up. The volume's up.
Yeah, that's if I'm understanding correctly, and I like this, I think we're actually discussing both the four strivings and also the following four legs of magical elimination, right?
Actually, no, I didn't start those yet. Those have a slightly different definition, so I didn't get to those yet.
Okay, well, because we're talking about aspiration, joyous effort, and shamatha vipassana, and that's what those are, right? So
Yeah, yeah. So those are just presented in a slightly different detail.
yeah,
Yeah, so we'll get into those next class, but
okay,
more in detail.
yeah,
They're connected though. You'll see how each one leads to the next. You'll see that in these 37, each, so you can. That's why they're connected. Is each one leads to the next.
yeah, and I like very much that you're making those connections. That really helps a lot. You know, the main thing that I was considering though is just that when we talk about joyous effort, and this kind of comes mainly from my studies of Shantideva, which I think probably virtually everyone has done, because we're on the Mahayana track, and that's that. Of course, joyous effort is you know talking in terms of the hierarchy, of the six perfections. It's a pretty high level accomplishment, because you start with generosity, where you're trying to weaken your attachment to, possessions and so on, to material things. And then you move on to ethics, where you're restraining yourself from non-virtue, and then to patience, which becomes harder yet because you're trying to keep your cool when people are pushing your button. And then finally, that leads into joyous effort, which to me, I mean, I can see the value, for example, in you know keeping your eye on the watch and trying to lengthen the period of time during which you're not getting agitated and so on. But to me, the most valuable part of it is just that arises spontaneously. And I think that it arises spontaneously because we've practiced those earlier cultivations of attitude with generosity and ethics and patience and so on. And then also, I think that, and I think this is mentioned in your talk in the scriptures, is that those six perfections, even though they're hierarchical, they're not discrete, so that we're practicing all of them at one and the same time with the concentration on one particular one. So to that extent that they're not just discrete, that we're also practicing the mental perfections of of meditation and wisdom. And then to the extent that especially that wisdom imbues those earlier ones, that and I'm thinking back on our study of Maitreya's other scripture, in the Uttara Tantra, that we're coming to understand that each being possesses uh, that ultimate nature, what we call Buddha nature, and that's the main impetus for our compassion, is that we see that this suffering doesn't need to go on as long as we can start uncovering, start eliminating the mental afflictions that obscure our Buddha nature. So to the extent that we begin seeing that, then in conjunction with attenuating our mental afflictions, our attachment to possessions, and cultivating our patience and so on, that starts arising spontaneously, that joyous effort. And it's not something that we have to dredge up so much. It just becomes a part of our nature because we're cultivating these things. And that's why, I can see why joyous effort is really kind of a high level achievement, because it means you've done a lot of hard work before that, and then finally, that you're also cultivating, that wisdom, which is on the basis of having cultivated the ability to meditate deeply. So that, I think we're getting, in my sense, and I'm not sure I'm entirely accurate on this, but my sense about starting with something which is more on the Shravaka track, with the cultivations of mindfulness and so on, and then we finally, at some point, we in the 37 harmonies get more into the Mahayana track, but be that as it may, I think, because I think probably all of us have started on the Mahayana track, that this influences that study, so that it's not just entirely discrete, But anyway, lots of thoughts swirling about in my mind's dream. But one of them also is, and maybe we can address this later because I don't know if there's time today, but I get a bit confused about this whole notion of what the bases are, because we start with the what is the technical term? We talk about the basis and then the paths, but I think the basis, as far as I've been able to determine, is mainly concerned with the Four Noble Truths and really kind of the Shravaka track, right?
I'm not sure what you mean basis, and there are different meanings of basis, but you mean basis in like basis, path, and result, or you mean basis in a different sense? There, you said basis and path, so I don't know if you meant that. there are different terms, ways that
Well,
Buddhists
as they're
use
defined, and I'm not
joy.
recalling the technical terms exactly right now, but just as we've studied them with regard to how they're presented in the study of Maitreya scripture, basis and paths. And I had a lot of trouble understanding um, the, um, forgetting the name exactly right now, but the definitions which are given, um, oh, forgive me, I'm losing it, but the definitions that are given from, what is the main commentary that gives the definitions? It's
I mean, like Jetson Choki Gelson's commentary, or
exactly that. And those
uh,
definitions are given by, typically referring to him to give the definitions. They're giving his definitions of the bases and then the paths. And I was kind of struggling with some of those definitions. They're just so technical and they're not really fleshed out, at least with regard to what I've been reading. So, but anyway, I've got off on too many tangents there. But the main point I wanted to raise was just that, my understanding of joy is separate within the context of the six perfections.
I'll make a couple quick, just quick points in response, and then Robin. But just quickly, two things. I guess one. Well, first of all, just in general, I think you made some good points, but I want to clarify 2 points. One is the 30, in terms of the 37 harmonies with enlightenment, all 37, just because it's important, just in overall context, that all 37 of those are have are practiced. They have a version that's practiced by uh, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, and then they have a version that's practiced by Bodhisattvas. And and there's and I guess what I would say is that the version practiced by the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas is common to Bodhisattvas. The issue, so there's not the issue is like there's Bodhisattvas. So first of all, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, so individual liberation vehicle practitioners, practice all 37 harmonies with enlightenment. And then Bodhisattvas also practice all 37. And the main difference is that, well, one is the motivation, of course, the Bodhisattvas practice with bodhicitta motivation. But also, as I gave the example last week about, mindfulness, uh, you know, a difference is like, for example, a Shravaka practices mainly mindfulness of their own body. A Bodhisattva practices mindfulness of their own body and the bodies of others and how they experience suffering. So it's like the difference is usually that a Bodhisattva practices the same ones, in other words, what the Shravaka practices, but also additional things because their goal is bigger, their path is longer. So that's one point: is that all 37 are common to both the vehicles of individual liberation and Bodhisattva vehicle, but that the main difference is that Bodhisattvas add on additional things. That's one point. And then the other point I was going to make is just about what you said about the perfection of joyous effort. Um, I think it's a couple important points. One is that you're right, in the sense that even when you're, in Lama Tsongkhapa makes the point that even when bodhisattvas are practicing the first of the perfections, generosity, they do it in a way that's integrating all six. Um, and then each one is intended to integrate all six perfections. And in terms of the hierarchy, the main issue is that on the bhumis, one becomes surpassing or accomplished, particularly accomplished at a certain perfection. And so so for example, so it would be like on the fourth bhumi, one becomes surpassing in the perfection of joyous effort. But as this text is saying, and one gain, and actually I would say, like, those who are, even when you're not yet on the path, right, you practice a certain kind of joyous effort, right? You start to have joy in practicing Dharma. And then what this is getting at is on the at this level, actually, is at the of the on the path of accumulation, there's the low, the low, middle, and high levels. And so actually in the middle level of the path of accumulation, there's a kind of, because you've practiced mindfulness to a certain extent, here you generate a kind of new level of joyous effort. That's not the same level you're going to have when you're on the fourth bhumi, of course. It's not like that. But you could generate a kind of, so the point being, at each level of the path, you generate a kind of, not at each level, but at various levels of the path, you generate new capacities for joyous effort. And so at this level of the path, which is on the path of accumulation, you, because of your practice of mindfulness in this case, you start to develop a kind of deeper practice of joyous effort because you've got this aspiration. Of course, when you're on the fourth bhumi, it's going to be a much higher level of, as you were saying, there are different levels of joyous effort, and the person at this level is not capable of that person's level. But they're capable of a level that's different than what they were able to do before, if that makes sense. Because and that's why these four supreme strivings um, integrate a kind of joyous effort. Is that they out of their practice of mindfulness, one generates a kind of new level of joyous effort at this point. Uh, so that's why it's emphasized here. But I think you're getting at a point which is like that's not exactly the same as the joyous effort. It's the same thing, quality of taking joy in doing virtue, but the ability to sort of be a master that practice differs at different points on the path. And this is one of those points where there's a kind of new level of joyous effort. So I think that's what's being gotten at here.
Yeah, I think the extent to which it becomes spontaneous, right? You know,
Spontaneous and also like without break, like so in other words, there like at this level one has a lot of joyous effort, but there's still what's the word? It's not um for example, a person on the path of accumulation who's achieved this level of, I'll give an example, like in their dreams, they might not in every single dream have joyous effort. The Bodhisattva on the seventh bhumi, even in every dream will have, they won't
yeah,
have a single dream without joyous effort. This person, they would probably wake up feeling joyous effort. They would have it all day, but then they sometimes get distracted. Maybe, well, even in the day, they might get distracted sometimes and have to come back. They're not somebody who, whereas on the seventh bhumi, that Bodhisattva, even in their deep sleep, it wouldn't maybe not deep sleep in Sutrayana, but even in their dreams, they have it. Even first thing when they wake up every day, whereas this person often has it, but no, it's not a continuous flow like a powerful river. But anyway, so it gets stronger as you go along. But I know we got to stop in a minute. So, Robin, do you have some brief before we stop?
Yeah, I was sort of going along the same track with John. If you like look at Lama Tsongkhapa's Illuminating the Intent on page 147, he talks about the fourth ground. He calls it the radiant. And the word they use is diligence. And so it gives us as opposed to perseverance, the idea of diligence. And like, Lauren is telling us that, it's an accumulative thing because the previous bhumi is patience, I think, correct? And, so just this one, he cites, Lama Tsongkhapa cites a passage from the Precious Garland that's the fourth is called the radiant, for the light of perfect gnosis has emerged. And for he has cultivated especially all the factors of enlightenment. So it's sort of an accumulative thing that you're really starting to put things in motion towards virtue. And then he does go on to talk about, or Thupten Jinpa starts comparing these aspects of the 37 factors later on page 148. So maybe that would be helpful. But I love the idea that it's radiant, it's shining, it's the light of gnosis is far brighter than the glow of shining copper. So it puts a wonderful spin on joyous effort, that it's glowing because it's so anyway, thanks. I just thought that might be helpful.
Beautiful. That's totally beautiful. Yeah, and it really, I'll conclude with this because it's just like one more minute, but I'll just conclude like, and it really is, there's different, because in terms of, you get the point here that, in other words, the person on the path of accumulation at this level really does have a kind of joyous effort that's remarkable compared to what they experienced before, what ordinary people experience. But, but for sure, I guess going back to John's question and point, there are for sure different levels. And I actually, this is making me remember, like, I was remembering, time I spent with Lama Zopa Rinpoche. So he was staying at my house. I'm just sharing a personal story just for a second. As like getting at the what this point is like I mean I loved and had so much devotion to Lama Zopa Rinpoche. So I was so joyous that he was there and getting to be with him. And but then there came a point he doesn't sleep, right? So there came a point I remember like where it was like it must have been 3 in the morning. We had started early in the morning and he had been teaching and I'd been driving him and then and I was like the capacity for joyous. I'm getting at the idea like there came a point where I was like I'm like, and he was like, now we can do this. And he's like taking out a text and he's like, now we can practice, like let's get, and where are all the letters? The letter we have to respond to everybody who has a question. All these people are suffering all over the world, and I was like going like, and I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna like, I won't be able to, tomorrow I can't stay awake. I'm gonna fall over. And then, but he had an ability. I remember him. He had an ability at joy where it was you could feel the joy, right? Like he was like, so there was no, there was an overwhelming, like I said, like a flow, like a powerful river of joy and effort. And it didn't matter if it was like, 4 in the morning, and I fell asleep, and then I'd wake up, and it's like 8 in the morning, and he's
Still,
doing, and he's ringing a bell and doing his puja and doing his practice, and and like, and then the next hour he's doing some other project for others, and then an insect came and he's running with it around the stupa because he's like, this is the one chance I have to benefit this insect that could be my, that was my mother in past lives, and so he's carrying it around the stupa, and you know, it was an unending, what's the word, like not just a flow, but like a torrent of joyous effort. And I would just like, no, I'm not, there's no way I'm not capable. Even if I want to be, there's no way I can do it. I'm not capable of that level of joyous effort. Obviously, it's no mystery, but I'm gonna give you an example, right?
yeah.
So when you talk about like somebody on the seventh bhumi or above that level, then they have an ability to have joyous effort that's, what's the word, it's not just in there, it's in there. I mean, he actually, even in their dream, he said that the one time he was at my house when I was over Shea, and he had been up for like 4 days straight or 7 days. I can't remember how many days. We hadn't slept. And then we were doing he was asking me to help. It was like the middle of the night, and he was asking me to help write something out. He was translating some text, I think. So I was writing down what he was saying. And then he suddenly went like this. And for maybe less than a minute, it looked like he was asleep. And then he opened his eyes again. Maybe it was a minute. And he said, ah, I was just walking around. He didn't say dream. He just said I was just walking around the Dalai Lama's temple in Bodh. Like so, he had fallen asleep for the first time in days for less than a minute or two. I don't know. And I guess he dreamed or had a or whatever
No,
that he was
probably was doing
circumambulating.
it.
He was doing it in
Yeah,
some
he
other
was doing
body, but he was like walking around the temple of the Dalai Lama, and then he was back and he said, "Oh, let's go." And he kept translating. So it's a different level of joyous effort that beings like that are capable of, obviously. Anyway, we went over, so we should stop. So, and the classes, we have 2 more classes already scheduled. I'll send out, I was just saying to Jan, it looks like because of Geshe Gelik visiting the center and my own schedule, we may only be able to have 1 class in July, but then in August we'll have 2. So we'll definitely have class. I'm 2 in June. We may only be able to do 1 in July, but then we'll have 2 in August again. So it looks like July will be a difficult month because of the center's schedule and my schedule sort of not syncing up, but we'll keep going with this. And you can see we're moving a little faster now because I think that was all on those. So next we'll do the 4 legs of what's called magical emanation next class. So we're going a little faster now, but sometimes we'll slow down if there's details. But these 4 we'll cover in 1 class. So, okay, Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. Right, that verse gets at 2 of the 4. Right, you get that verse is 2 of the 4 strivings. Then in the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these virtues, which are merely labeled, totally empty from the outside, to the I, who is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side. May achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And may we all, through studying this teaching of Maitreya's, be able to actually practice, the 4 supreme strivings with great joyous effort, and thereby progress, along the path to Buddhahood for the welfare of all beings. And John has a comment. If you want, you can go ahead and make it, John, for a comment. Yeah. Or do you have your hand up?
Are you talking to me? Or,
Yeah. Oh, it looks like your hand's up, but maybe it's just from
oh,
before.
no, maybe I forgot to lower it. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
that was all. Okay. Oh, no problem. I just saw it and I thought, I didn't realize you had another for before. But okay, well, thanks everybody. And we already have classes scheduled for June, so we're good. And I'll send out the one in July soon.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.